Okay, hello and welcome back, everyone, or welcome for the first time if you're just joining us for our penultimate session of the two-day symposium. So yeah, this panel is going to be on discursive practices, context of exploitation, and depictions of violence. And starting us off is Arturo Luna Loranca. And Arturo received a PhD and an MA in history from Emory University and his BA in Latin American and Latino studies from the University of Illinois, Chicago. And recently started a postdoctoral fellowship and is working on a book manuscript about the dog massacres of Mexico City during the 18th century. And today is going to be presenting a presentation titled "It Was a Friend of Mine, Narrating Human-Dog Encounters During the Time of Slaughter in Mexico City, 1770 to 1820. So, Arturo, if you want to share your slides.
Sure. Are you able to hear me well?
Louder.
Can you hear me?
Right. We'll try turning the volume on.
Okay, wait. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
That's good? Okay. Let me share the slides just a second.
Yeah, so if you go to the top right-hand corner and click share, then you share your screen.
Content only, maybe? Oh, screen. Okay. Give me a second. I'm trying to. Okay. Can you hear the? Can you see it now?
Yeah. Can you just try making it full screen so we can see it?
Okay. Can you see it now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to start the presentation because I think we only have 15 minutes for each. Okay. So now imagine that you're in Mexico City in the 18th century. And if you've never seen pictures of Mexico City during the 18th century, we have here an image, which is the one that's going to be the left corner. So it's November 24, 1793. It's a dimly lit night. And there's this Havanese dog. If you haven't seen a Havanese dog, is the one on the right. Is this ball of fur. And so this Havanese dog running through the streets of Mexico City at night, and right behind her, it's a night watchman, which is in the middle, and is pursuing this Havanese dog, and the dog is trying to escape, trying to find a place where to hide, and suddenly she finds the place that she needs to hide. It's a building under construction that it's in a street named Tacuba, and she goes into the building, hides there, and the night watchman is following her soon. Suddenly, a man by the name of Jose Tamayo shows up and tells the night watchman to not enter the property because it's a private place, and that the dog is also belongs to someone else. The night watchman doesn't listen to this. He goes into the property, finds the dog and questions, and kills her. Not only her, but also two of her weaning pups. Although gruesome, this kind of stories were not unusual for the 18th century. From 1790 all the way to 1821, there was a series of dog slaughters in Mexico City, which we don't know the extent of them. We don't know the exact number of dogs that were killed during this time because we don't have enough records. Some of the records that we have are like the ones that you see on the left, in which basically they're very short. They just state, this night we killed this many dogs, and so far we've killed this many dogs. In the case of the one that you have on the left, it says that they killed 475 dogs up to that moment. And just to give you some like numbers at a glance, at this time in the 18th century, Mexico City is the most populated city in the Americas, and maybe in the Western Hemisphere. I'm not sure about that. So by 1790, the human population of Mexico City was close to 100,000 people. By 1820, that increased to 179,000. And its dog population, we don't really know. There's only 2 instances in which the government tried to guess how many dogs lived in Mexico City. The first one was in 1790, which stated that there were around 20,000 dogs at the time. And the second one is in 1821, which they stated that there were like 30,000 dogs at the time. By the number of reports that survive about the number of killed dogs, there's only 88 reports that survive the passage of time. Taking the average of dogs that they wrote down, it's estimated that they kill about 10 dogs per night, which is really difficult to state how many dogs were killed at the end, because if it's only 10 dogs per night throughout 30 years, that's up to 100,000 dogs, which I think it's a lot. And let's say if they only killed 2 dogs per night, that's 20,000 dogs, which is not enough, because we have some first eyewitnesses from the 18th century that state that they killed 20,000 dogs only within the first 4 years of the slaughters. So it's really difficult to know how many dogs were killed. But at least for this presentation, I'm going to tell you why they killed them. So in order to get to that why, I have divided the presentation into 5 different parts. The first one, I'm just going to give you a really brief overview about human-dog relationships in New Spain, what is nowadays Mexico, kind of. I'm going to compare this last dog slaughter from the 18th century to other ones that happened before it. And then I'm going to look at the ones from the 18th century and give you more details about them and see how they interact with other fields of study. I'm going to give you some examples of how dogs were other during the 18th century. And last, I'm going to go through some other kinds of human-dog relationships that were not necessarily based on violence that also happened during the 18th century. So I guess wanted to show you some maps. So the one on the left is it's a map of New Spain at the time. It's basically what is now Mexico. So you have there the Gulf of Mexico and all of that. And then the one on the right is a image of Mexico City at the time. So it's basically almost an island that is only connected to the mainland through these bridges. And then where the dog slaughters happen is just in the center of Mexico City. I don't know if you're able to see this clearly, but if you see like in the center, there's like this giant squares. That's the what is called the Spanish Traza, which is basically where Spaniards lived nominally, because actually people of the kinds lived in there. And then if you see like the tiny dots, those are indigenous neighborhoods. So the dog slaughters happen actually where there's like the big squares. Okay. So dogs had a really long history in what was then New Spain, that dated back to pre-Columbian times. In central Mexico, at least among the Nahua, which is basically the Aztecs, they had different kinds of dogs. One of them was the squinkle, which is the one on the upper left, which is basically just a common dog. It's not big. It has hair. And then the other one is the Shelly Squinkle, which translates into rare or strange dog, which is the one that a lot of people think, I think, no, it's the hairless Mexican dog. And then you also had another one that was called the Tlachichi, which is the one in the middle, in the upper middle, which was a small dog with short legs. And then you also have reports about the dogs that likely didn't exist, but Spaniards wrote about them, which is like this humped dog in the lower middle part. All of these dogs, these 4 dogs, were pre-Columbian dogs. They were different from European dogs in the sense that they were smaller. People didn't use them for hunting, but instead they used them as companionship, bed warmers. They would sleep with them. They would also use them as food, or they would use them during ritual sacrifices. Then in 1521, we have the first introduction of European dogs, which is on the right side, which are very different kind of dogs. The first dogs that Spaniards brought to the Americas were sighthounds and greyhounds and bloodhounds, sorry. And they were mainly used for hunting, but later during the Spanish conquest, they would also use mastiffs, which are like large, massive dogs, and they would use them as weapons during the war, or they would use them to terrorize natives, like in the image that we have all the way to the right. Now, an unforeseen aspect of introducing dogs is that European dogs is that they basically decimated the native population of dogs. Just like with humans, European dogs brought with them diseases and diseases for which pre-Columbian dogs were not prepared for. So there was a big demographic debacle of pre-Columbian dogs. Out of all the kinds of pre-Columbian dogs that I mentioned, only the Xoloscuincle, the hairless dog, basically survives to this day. The other ones are completely extinct. But with the arrival of European dogs and the end of the Spanish conquest, at least in central Mexico, there was an issue with them. Spaniards didn't have any use for them by the 1530s, so like 10 years after the conquest. And basically, they just let them loose, which created what Spaniards called maroon dogs, which is basically dogs that were once domesticated and then became wild. And that population grew quite fast and quite rapid. And it produced a series of conflicts between human populations in Mexico City and maroon dogs, which basically was that dogs started attacking the local cattle population. And the way that the government sought to solve this problem was by issuing a series of ordinances, in Spanish they're called bandos, in which they requested that anyone could kill any of these dogs. And if you possess one of the a dog within Mexico City and you didn't have it on with a muzzle or on a leash, you would be subject to different kinds of fines. We know this because by the 1530s, we have recollections about how the maroon dogs are a big problem in Mexico City. One of them was written by Juan Suarez de Peralta, which is basically the nephew-in-law of Conquistador Hernán Cortés. And the ordinances were issued multiple times. So they were issued in 1532, 1556, 1571, 1574, 1575, 1580, and 1584, which demonstrates in a way that they didn't quite work because they had to reissue those ordinances once and over again. Now, concerning this first dog slaughter, we don't know how many dogs were killed. There's no records about that. But we know that at least it happened because of the ordinances. The second big dog slaughter in Mexico City happened in the early 18th century, which was in 1709. And that was due to the first dog-sustained rabies episodic in the Americas. There was the first case in the Americas in which there was large population of animals that contracted rabies. There's two theories about this. One of them is that cattle practices introduced by Europeans degraded the environment to the point that bats were in contact with other animals and they were able to transmit rabies. But according to the last research that they've done about this rabies epidemic, is that actually rabies was introduced by one or multiple rabies infected dogs that came from Europe to the Americas. Now, for this one, we also don't have documents that support or that tell us how many dogs were killed. We know that it happened because there's narratives, there's accounts, there's testimonies about the rabies epidemic. And we also have a couple of letters from it's called the Tribunal del Protomedicato, which is basically a board of physicians, which requested the government to kill any dog that they encounter. And the last dog slaughter, and which is the topic of this short presentation, happened at the end of the 18th century. It began in 1790 with the ordinance that was issued by the viceroy then, which was second Count of Revillagigedo. And this one's different from the other ones. The first instance is different because it doesn't happen during an episode of rabies. There's very few reported cases of rabies during the late 18th century. I found at least reported like 15 of them. And one of them, like two of them, did involve dogs, but one of them was for a pet dog and the other one was a stray. So there's not a lot of rabies cases. The second thing that makes this dog slaughter different is that the government for the first time created a, that for the first time it adjudicated the task of killing dogs to a specific group of government employees, which were the night watchmen. And the last thing that makes this very different is that we do have reports, those 88 reports that have survived, about how many dogs were killed. And the number of dogs killed per night varies widely. Sometimes they're only requesting for each night watchman to kill 2 dogs. Sometimes they're asking for them to kill 10, 20, or 30 dogs, which I don't think they were able to do, because they also had other tests that they had to carry. And it also seems that the greatest number of dogs that were killed usually happened before a religious ceremony or importance, because they basically wanted to keep the streets clean or free of dogs. And one of those cases is in 1797 when the viceroy receives a letter from a man that only signs as a slave of Holy Lady of Guadalupe, requesting that they kill the dogs just before the festivity of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Give me a second. Now, some of the reasons that they give for within the bundle is that dogs are a nuisance, that they bark a lot, that they present a physical danger to the population, and all that. But we also have other letters that were written by what is called the Síndico Personal del Común, which basically was a public trustee. It was a person that allegedly represented the common people within the government structure in the Cabildo, which is the township. And they had this faculty of requesting laws or making laws and all that. And we have a lot of letters from the syndicos in which they explain the reasons why they're looking to eliminate dogs. One of them is that they pollute the place through their bodily excretions. The other one is that they are a bad moral example for the human population because dogs made in public, which was bad for the kids to witness. The other ones that they propagate rabies or that they might bite someone. And one of the last ones that attracted my attention a lot is that they call them wasteful consumers of resources, in which basically they explained that people used to feed dogs instead of giving that food to the poor. And they are very explicit about this. They mentioned that dogs do not eat grass or wheat, they demand meat or bread. And one of the arguments is that if people, instead of buying this meat or bread for the dogs, if they save that, it would be easier for them to sustain their families. Or if they gave that food to the poor, that would be more productive. But turns out that Mexico City is not the only one that makes these kinds of arguments. We have other examples that are complaining about the consumption of resources by dogs. In London, we have a episode. It's not a dog slaughter per se, but it's the Parliament passes what is called the dog tax, which basically was a tax on the number of dogs that people own. And the reason behind it is that dogs were consuming too many resources, that it was bad for the poor to have dogs. And by putting this dog tax, the government expected people to kill their dogs in order not to pay the tax. There's another dog slaughter in Paris in 1780, and there's another one in Toulouse, France. And of course, in Spain, also in Madrid, and in Valladolid, there's also another dog slaughter. And what all these dog slaughters have in common is that they happen in the northern hemisphere during what is known as the Little Ice Age, which is just this period that goes from the 1500s all the way to the 1800s of climate change. For the case of New Spain, there's two specific climatological events that affected the region during the Little Ice Age. One of them is the Malda anomaly, which was basically, I'm not going to go into details, but it's a shift in atmospheric pressures. And the other one is the Dalton minimum, which is a period of low sun activity, low sunspot activity. And what that translated to the case of New Spain, it was that during the late 18th century, there's a series of droughts, frost, a lot of rainfall, a series of crop failures, and finally famine. There's a lot of episodes of famine at the end of the 18th century, which the worst of the famine episodes was in 1786, which was later known as the Year of Hunger. And that translated into a rapid demographic growth for Mexico City. So a lot of people from the countryside weren't able to sustain themselves due to this climate change, and they ended up migrating to Mexico City. And just to show like the effects of this is that between 1772 and to the 1800s, the human population of Mexico City increased by 50%. And of course, authorities took notice of this and they tried to alleviate it as much as they could. They opened public kitchens, but the other reason that the other activity that they tried to do was to kill dogs in order for dogs not to increase the price of grain by consuming it. But as we know through studies of genocide, and I think this is, I know that genocide, human genocide and animal killing is different, but I think that they intersect in some points, just like in this case. As we know through the study of genocide, is that the lack of resources or dwindling resources do not always lead to the mass killing of others. They also require other aspects, that is a hierarchized understanding of society, scapegoating, othering, or to normalize atrocious behavior to the group considers another. And in the case of New Spain,
I'm going to have to ask you to try and wrap up because we've gone a bit over time. But yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry, we do have a lot of cases of this, which is basically that the clergy always forbade the possession of dogs because they saw it as something bad, that people would care more about the dogs than the poor. And I'm just going to give you a quick glimpse of the other examples of how people interacted with dogs besides the massacres, because people continue to have dogs. We have the case of dog owners, like the story which I began with the Havanese dog. The dog owner took the night watchman to court and explained the reasons why he wanted the dog, and he said, well, it guards my property, it does something for me. Another one that's really interesting is for indigenous women that work as food vendors. There's a lot of reports stating that these indigenous women made the slaughters very difficult because they would just get into conflicts with the night watchmen who had to kill the dogs. And the reason that they give is that these dogs were their companionship. Like they didn't belong to them. They were basically village dogs, but they would accompany them from their indigenous towns to Mexico City and then back forth. And that made created a sense of bond and companionship. And the last one is that also the really poor that live in Mexico City care about street dogs because dogs produce something that was very useful, feces, poop. Because dog feces was used to make leather. So there were people in Mexico City that worked picking dog poo and selling that to the leather manufacturers. And that's a way that they made a living. And just as a quick conclusion, what I wanted to show with this is that there's two ways that people understood dogs. One of them was through discourse, and then the other one was through lived experience, and neither of them were the same. Authorities continue to state that dogs were bad or they were a danger to humankind. People that lived with them and interacted with them in different ways, such as dog owners, indigenous women, or the really poor, had a very different understanding about these the presence of dogs in the streets. Okay, and that's it. Sorry for going over time. Thanks.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I'll just catch up time and try and be very quick. But next presentation, we've got Olatz, and they are going to be presenting on weaponized compassion. So Zookeeper and non-human animals shared vulnerabilities, challenges, and human-non-human bonds in Spanish zoological parks. So yeah, over to you, Olatz. I think your mic's on.
We can't hear you, Olatz. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sound working now?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, thank you.
Great, sorry about that. And now, let's see, can you also see the slides well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, well, first of all, I want to thank the CIFAS for organizing this conference, especially the organizing committee for making this space possible, both virtually and presentially, Bianca, Cameron, and Jessie. As it was just said, I will be presenting a work we did on Zookeeper and non-human shared vulnerabilities, challenges, human-on-human bonds in the Spanish zoological parks. This work was done by my colleague Júlia, Castellano, and me in the beginning of this year, and it is really important before we get into the situation to make clear that this is a work based on the interviews that we did, so it shares and delves into the zookeepers' perspectives specifically. So this interview series was part of the Compass project, and we are part of the Center for Animal Ethics. And this specific research, thanks to the editors of this next volume, will appear as a chapter in the following year. And this book looks into the entanglements of humans and other animals in the animal industrial complex. In our case, we focus on the entertainment industry. So as part of the PhD research I'm doing, looking into the Spanish animal-based entertainment industry, and specifically what lobbies or interest groups do, we have been focusing on the discourse that they disseminate and seeing how it might be affecting the public compassion or the ethics of society when it comes to using animals for entertainment. It ranges from bullfighting to cockfighting to also zoos, aquariums, and animal theme parks. Now, when looking into this, there was something that we felt that was missing, and it was the perspective about the workers, because throughout all the content that I had been analyzing for years now, we saw that all over the content, workers and zookeepers are everywhere. They are the face of the parks. They are part of the campaigns they use to represent themselves to the public and to justify their job. They might do it connecting it to research, to education, to highlight the bonds that caretakers and zookeepers have with non-human animals in captivity, and to also show these kind of emotions that if you go to these parks, you might share with them, with all these smiles and caretaking experiences. So in this interview-based research, we focused on people who have taken care of or are currently taking care of or what are considered wild non-human animals, and that up to some extent are exposed to the public and spend most of the time with them. So when it comes to zoological parks, we ended up having interviewees that come from zoos, aquariums, animal theme parks, but also from rescue centers that have animals that have been taken out from illegal wild animal trafficking. And they take care of them there, but they also use these animals for entertainment. And the zookeepers, Zookeeper is like a very wide label, but we use it to refer to people that are veterinarians, that have studied biology, caretakers, cleaning staff, and also researchers. Now, the first step for this for us was to get the ethical approval, because we work with a lot of sensitive data, and by previous experiences of people that have complained or shown the situation of their workplace, there has been a lot of repression, and we were concerned about the safety of the people that we interviewed, but also about possible repercussions later on if they wanted to keep working in the same industry. We also treated issues like mental health and safety, and some of the things that we talked about were really triggering for the interviewees. So the first thing was to get the ethical approval, which took months, but we were able to do it, to be able to meet the interviewees in the middle ground. And we ended up conducting up to 17, but including in the publication, 16 semi-structured interviews with both workers and ex-workers. The average age of the people that we interviewed was 34 years old. More than half of them were women, and 37.5% were men, no other genders interviewed. And their tasks ranged from cleaning, feeding, preparing the diets, maintaining the installations, caretaking, but also breeding these individuals in captivity, and up to some extent, enrichment. They also worked with them in shows. So we recorded all our interviews. Most of them were done via online. And then we transcribed them with Whisper AI, and the analysis of this, we did coding it with coding the transcripts with Atlas AI. So what are the results? What can we see in these experiences? What do they tell us about? Even if we structured the interviews to look into different dimensions of their work, 4 main issues arise at the end. It was that the industry and the sector were being quite problematic, up to some extent, admired up to another, and considered necessary too. They highlighted the connections that they had with non-human animals they worked with, and something that really arose as problematic and stressful for them, connected to the mental health that they were struggling with, was the social perception. So we did not expect to have a generalized or a very homogeneous answer when it comes to self-perception in the industry or their experience working in zoos. But it was really interesting and surprising to see the way in which it ranged from one point of the interview to another, even with the same person. Because while idealizing some aspects of the workplace, even like the same person, that people that were saying the best things about working with animals in this situation, they were the same people that were saying the most harsh and had even the most traumatic and shared experiences. There were several interviews that ended up with crying, and that meant having to go through things that people haven't been able to deal with because of how the industry doesn't support the workers. So we can see that there's a lot of having to balance the vulnerabilities and the compassion they feel, but also the vocation they have. One of the things that surprised us in the beginning, because we tried to make an informed literature review that was first trying to connect and to see what the workers were saying, and then look into what the literature said about them, instead of going with preconceptions to the interviews. And it surprised us that many people asked themselves whether, from the very beginning, whether what they were doing was ethical, if they were sure, that they saw themselves saying, I have been against zoos all my life, I've been against no human animal captivity all my life, I like them, what am I doing here? What am I perpetuating? How can someone enjoy seeing them here? They showed a wide range of ethical conflicts, ranging from discomfort but accepting the captivity because it was connected to conservation or to education up to some extent. So they considered that some individuals should be sacrificed for the sake of a whole species. There were also people who were really critical but sacrificial, in the sense that they would rather stay in a precarious condition and work in an industry that they don't feel comfortable with, as long as it meant that the people taking care of the animals actually cared about them and did more than most people would. And there were also some people with an awareness of incoherent values according to them, in their own words. So, as I said before, there were people that were against zoos in the beginning, but something that appeared in several interviews was that, according to the very workers, they say that many of the people working as caretakers in zoos in Spain actually have a very similar ideology to those that work in sanctuaries or rescue centers, that they are working to improve as much as possible the welfare of the animal, but that because of the situation with needing a salary and needing to do more than voluntary work, they ended up only finding a way to help animals through these industries. When it comes to the industry, there were many critiques, frustrations regarding the environmental challenges that the zoo wouldn't accept changing, even if the zookeepers organized and tried to do it formally. There were a lot of frustration with visitor expectations of feeding and physical contact, and also with bureaucracy and the chain of command. So people complained, for example, about seeing not just the animals that are being used in spectacles, but also surrounding areas that every time a show starts and the music starts getting really loud, they will go to the interior rooms to avoid the noise. And it's something repetitive, it happens daily, and everybody knows it, but they do nothing, even if other workers will complain about it, because it's part of what makes more revenue for the zoo. And this is for the animals that actually have an interior room to go to avoid the noise. There are many that don't have it and have to listen to the same music 4 or 5 times a day with the same intensity. They also complain about being in the work hierarchy at the bottom of the ladder. So even if they are the ones that are getting paid the least, and don't actually, for example, they don't have a specific working agreement. So many of them are working with working agreement of builders, of educators, and having no insurance connected to it, to specific risks. For example, cleaning tanks with venomous animals, with the working agreement of a teacher. And they complain about the lack of protocols. So many cost-based decisions were described with no welfare consideration, and with things that we might think maybe the park cannot afford making a structural change. But the examples they gave were things like a ball or a shampoo that for a group of more than 20 birds, for example, would mean having an enrichment that they know they love and has been working for years. But suddenly, because the owner changes, now the workers have to either pay for it themselves, or just these individuals lose this enrichment and this kind of input or change, just because the new owner doesn't want to pay €4 for a bottle of shampoo every 3 months. They will also talk about malpractices, for example, that because of the lack of protocols or lack of transparency, veterinarians will approve a specific animal going into an exhibition without looking into it, even when workers are complaining. So there will be a seal of approval of veterinarians without checking on the animals, while the zookeepers are saying this individual is not okay, is not feeling, is not with the right mood, they need to get their ointment given. But because the veterinarian approves that they should go out, then this individual doesn't get the ointment applied, or the treatment is interrupted. And in the most negative aspect of this, many caretakers that worked in this place ended up feeling that they couldn't handle this. And we heard about many anecdotes of people saying that they became caretakers to take care of animals for them to be as best as possible given the conditions, but not to fight with administrations and taking all this suffering and frustration daily, because you still see how bored the animals are every day. They ended up leaving because they couldn't handle it. Others also describe a more positive situation because of a supportive and more organized team of zookeepers, and being able to apply some positive reinforcements or enrichments or changes in the installations was shown as the most gratifying thing that could happen to them. It's also really interesting to see that there was a recognition of clashing interests between what the workers wanted and what would be best for the animals and what the companies were doing. So they talked about marketing and public-oriented changes as something that was really annoying for them, because instead of improving the life quality of many animals, they would look into mostly improving the colors of, for example, an iconic species like a tiger. Other people introduced the idea of non-human animal work in the interview, saying that they thought that some things, for example, like not having non-human animals exposed to the public, but having them work for their care up to a point was more ethical, because most of them shared a wish to avoid having to depend on visitors for money, wanting to keep issues like conservation and education, but not up to an extent where entertainment would be so important. So I'm going to show a small video of something that people we interviewed recognized as being, well, they showed it to us, something being recorded in Spain in an animal park, where they take non-human animals from illegal wild animal trafficking. And what happens there is that they get little to no public funding, and they are not open to the public. So what they do is they use these animals for TV spots and movies. And for example, this advertisement, I don't know if you have seen it, but it was quite popular in Spain. But this was an actual thing. And according to the workers, thanks to this, this tiger got an incredible increase of the land they had, of enrichment. They could buy many more land for other individuals as well, and talked very positively about it. So overall, what could we say that were the main shared problems between non-human animals and the working staff here? It was the lack of staff and professionalization. There was an inconsistent care described, and unfamiliarity with the individuals and the species they were taking care of. Lots of people are assuming positions that they really are not qualified for, and they are being asked to create enrichments for species and for individuals they don't know, just so that the zoos can get a specific premium seals and belong to specific communities. The education is usually focused on practical tasks, and they acknowledge there is a huge neglecting of animal care and behaviors. So they don't teach them how to deal with the animals, what signals, body language, how to communicate with them, and how to improve. They also talk a lot about precarity and sacrifices, both economical, emotionally, physically, and with time. They talk about demanding tasks and about vocation being used against them. They talk about a precariousness that especially affects animals, and the zookeepers we interviewed directly said that even if they suffered it a lot, they ended up taking mental health. Some of the people we interviewed took mental health leaves shortly after the interview, or were taking medication because of depression or anxiety as a result of the work. They said that the individuals suffering most of this precarity were the non-human animals, because there are so many that they just cannot attend. So they consider it even a tool of manipulation, because the people hiring them know that the workers will not go home if the animals are not getting dinner. They will get and end up being left without food. So even if you don't get paid for overtime, they stay, and they end up having to choose in between themselves and the animals they take care of, and they are taken advantage of because of that. And there was a really intense situation in several interviews where they talked about this destroying of vocation, of them just wanting to do the best and getting totally destroyed vocation that they had since they were a child, and getting totally burnt out and leaving the industry. So in these connections, we can see that there is a vulnerability shared against these bad practices, that there are economic conditions pushing people to work in this industry and to be here, but also that the levels of support and individual confidence meant that some people would accept more or leave. Some people also go against direct orders and do not sacrifice individuals or disabled non-human animals against direct orders. And they also conduct independent research to reduce mortality and to even breed situ. So while they talk about having to maintain a specific distance because of how often these animals change enclosures, they also talk about this bond being one of the most beautiful things for them, this genuine connection. And they share a lot of traumatic deaths and the lack of control with moving of animals. Now, to finish with the presentation, I'm sorry I went a bit over time. They argue that there is a social misperception that is burning bridges that could be used for collaboration between people that want to make zoos and animal theme parks more animal-centered and the workers there. They argue that there has to be a reframing on the debate of zoological parks to transition to a more friendly and more fair model, according to them. And many things need to change, but they are trying to push it isolatedly from inside with no support from the outside, while getting accused of being the embodiment of animal captivity. So they are the first one, they argue, concerned with changing those kind of things, and we should be collaborating instead of fighting in social media or getting accusations or getting even death threats. They also talk about the hypocrisy of people not realizing that up to some extent, there are many individuals that come from the exotic pet industry. So that industry is directly connected and should also be regulated, the illegal trade and anthropogenic harms. That means that they have to take care of these individuals. So overall, they share challenges, vulnerability, and precarity. We can see that zookeepers have a great dedication, but that doesn't mean that their ethical dilemmas doesn't put them in a situation where they are being sometimes hypocritical. They have limitations, and there are potential collaboration that we might be overlooking. The zoo industry actually employs a weaponized compassion to use zookeepers for marketing while human washing while exploiting them. And there are connected improvements that if worker rights were improved in this sector with working agreements, transparency, public budget, and more professionalization, it will really impact the daily lives of many, many individuals in captivity in Spain. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for that. Another really interesting talk. So for the final talk of this panel, we've got Justine Groizard. Justine is an ECR at the University of Newcastle in Australia. Her research looks at intersectional oppressions and how they play out in the social spheres of human-non-human relationships. And we're presenting today on the story of greyhound purity. So, again, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Can everyone hear me okay and see the slides okay?
Yep.
I don't use Teams very much, so okay, good. They're all like big. Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, good afternoon. And from here, it's nearly midnight over here in Australia. Coming to you from Wanneroo land. And I just wanted to put out there that Wanneroo land was the main space in which I worked, and wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I work on. So I just want to start off by saying thank you for having me. It's been such a great conference so far. So I received my doctorate in February this year from the University of Newcastle in New South Wales, and my thesis was entitled The Greyhound and Ethnography of Stories and Symbols. So I'm going to be discussing a section within one of my chapters, and the chapter that I'm drawing from is the third chapter of the thesis, and it's entitled Stories of Greyhounds. So today specifically I'm going to be talking about greyhound purity. Okay, so because we're such an international audience, I did want to give some background on greyhound racing and greyhounds in Australia. So greyhound racing is closely interconnected with the colonial history and white settlement in this country. Greyhounds were brought over by the First Fleet as part of the European invasion. The sport took root in 1927 with greyhounds chasing a mechanical lure around a long circular course. And the sport that we recognise today as greyhound racing was established in Australia by the early 20th century. And I should note there's no non-commercial dog racing in Australia. So as an Australian sport, it's had ties with betting right from its inception. And it's important to note here that gambling is not only super normalized and accepted and even expected aspect of greyhound racing, but all animal-based sports. And it's a normalized part of sporting in Australia. Gambling is a huge cultural practice and expected norm within Australia. So in recent years, racing's moved from a distinct social space, sort of secluded, to a highly political and publicised topic. The surge in public scrutiny of the moral standing of the industry and the associated community with the industry began in 2015 when the animal rights organisation Animals Australia exposed the practice of baiting greyhounds to attack and kill other largely defenceless animals. So it was possums, cats, piglets, stuff like that. This first exposure of malpractice within the industry, and then coupled with a second exposure of Australian greyhounds being subject to unethical conditions once exported overseas, drew attention to greyhound racing's most prominent issue and the reason for the existence of the greyhound racing sphere, which is unwanted dogs. So in response to the findings of animal cruelty against both greyhounds and other species of animals, the New South Wales government launched a special commission of inquiry to decide whether greyhound racing would continue in the state. On the 7th of July 2016, this report was released, and the Premier of the state announced that greyhound racing was going to be banned. This decision was fought by those within the racing industry, and in September 2016, so about 3 months later, their campaign resulted in an overturn of the ban. So while the racing community said that this was a win, not only for them, but actually for the dogs, those who worked with the same animals as part of their rescue work vowed to keep fighting to save the same beings that apparently it was benefiting. So with this issue of unwanted and excess greyhounds made public, organisations focusing on mitigating the problem were brought into the spotlight, and they were marked as key players in this racing rescue contention. So the peoples of New South Wales, even those with no prior experience with greyhounds, began to ask themselves and one another, was greyhound racing morally right or was it morally wrong? So it became clear that greyhounds, as markers of a distinct social space within Australia, represented a contested domain. So my research was conducted as an ethnography. I'm an anthropologist, and this one was a multi-species ethnography, which essentially means that I'm taking notice of not just the humans in my work, but the animals. So obviously that was mostly greyhounds, but it did include any other animals that I came upon during fieldwork. So I officially entered the field in March 2019, and I dedicated my time to interviews and participant observation for 18 months. So the participant perspectives and their activities were what guided the research, and basically, that was what led what we actually did on fieldwork. So as a result of that, it was largely based around either helping to train and care for racing greyhounds, or helping to care for rescue dogs in either their shelters or their foster homes or their adopted homes. So a lot of common activities included walking dogs, trialing dogs, transporting dogs, playing with dogs, cleaning up after dogs, and simply spending time with dogs and sharing their lives. So you can see in the image there, that's actually a photo a participant took of me doing some field work, obviously having a horrific time with a litter of racing puppies. So the thesis in this chapter specifically focuses on the power of stories. So I argue that the ability to tell and to learn of stories, to engage in storytelling, is rooted in experience throughout life that then culminates in knowledges, and that these knowledges are situated and they can't be separated from experience in which they are formed. So I draw on Haraway a lot for that kind of stuff. So I argue that stories are important because it's how people utilize their stories, that like the why of a storytelling or retelling, which relates to how the stories are interpreted by the storyteller. So to draw on Haraway's later work, it matters which stories we use to tell stories. And Haraway comes up with that by drawing on anthropologist Marilyn Strathern's argument that it matters which ideas we use to think other ideas. So during my time in the field, particular stories would coalesce, and eventually it became clear that there were certain greyhound tales that were really dominant, and that my research participants were all telling these stories with intent. So there was a reason why these particular stories were told. And as Sarah Ahmed argues, all familiar narratives deserve careful and close readings. So my conceptualizing of humans who share their lives with greyhounds as being greyhound oriented denotes not only how greyhound individuals were mostly present during my time in the field, but also how an affiliation with the breed and or an individual greyhound contributed to a person's understanding of self. So greyhound shrines often framed interview spaces and ended up being a common indicator for me of if someone was going to be a participant, in that they were greyhound oriented. So you can see in the image there, that's an example of a greyhound shrine. So Davis, Floyd and Laughlin describe shrines as specific places in homes and other places that reflect and display people's beliefs and values. And the homes of the greyhound oriented housed a myriad of greyhound shrines. So we're talking about pillows with cartoon greyhounds and greyhound images, winning race photographs, greyhound mugs, greyhound figurines, greyhound statues, greyhound calendars, greyhound paintings. And this is in addition to embodied shrines, so greyhound tattoos, clothing with greyhound on them, greyhound car stickers. And this is also in addition to any objects that the individual and the greyhound actually physically benefited from. So water and food dishes on the floor, beds and toys, and other symbols paying homage around the home. So while some greyhound tales created moral contestation and drew greyhound-oriented individuals apart, others drew smaller groups together. This imagining actually drew a large group together. So basically all my participants could be grouped under this sort of banner as someone greyhound-oriented and loving of the pure status of greyhounds. So that's, all racing participants from invested anti-racing campaigners and long-term racing people took pride in their greyhounds being a part of something beyond their individual selves. So a member of this well-built, well-known, functional, aesthetically pleasing and old breed. So anti-racing advocate and adopter Chloe, who quoted here, described how greyhounds are genetically good because they're built to be good in terms of activity. And obviously it's my emphasis there. So in this way, greyhounds are sort of thought of as being good because they're pure. And I sort of started noticing this idea of goodness and purity as entwined, and making that is what, sorry, there's a whippet under my desk having a snort attack. That's what that noise is. Goodness and purity are entwined, and that is what makes the greyhound who they are. So this was interesting because it struck me because it came up so much in people who were actually against racing. So, so much, it was really strongly believed that so much of what was so good and unique about these dogs that we're so in love with was that they were bred for racing, even if the person saying that didn't actually agree with racing as a practice. Quoted here, I've got Elaine, who's an anti-racer, and she's a past foster carer. And she said to me outright that despite her dislike of greyhound racing, she feared to see the industry close down. and that she said it's because of her love of greyhounds as an old and pure breed that she did not necessarily want it. She didn't want it to be banned. She was like, I want it to keep going. I just don't want anything to do with it at all. I don't want to go anywhere near it because I don't like it, but I want it to keep going because I love these dogs. So in this way, notions of good and pure are so entwined here. Elaine argued that racing industry breeding regulations facilitate greyhounds being bred to be athletes and therefore breed purity, and that it's the purity that keeps the temperament and the intelligence of the animals from deviating from what is acceptable or what is good. And these feelings were backed up by several participants who are morally opposed to greyhound racing. So yeah, not just for Elaine, but for several participants, a ban on the sport would actually not be worth it for them, despite them being against it in other ways. So for these greyhound lovers, extinction didn't just simply mean the loss of the breed, but rather a muddling of this pure and distinct breed with others. So here, I draw on animal studies scholar Fiona Probyn-Rapsey, who argues that this kind of fear of extinction is based at a moment where extinction stops being about death and it actually starts being about birth. So the greyhound breed going extinct was also not the only eventuality participants feared if racing was banned. Pro racer and greyhound adopter Coram, who's going to be quoted on the next slide, and greyhound adopters Catherine and Dev, who are quite neutral, they're quoted here, didn't just fear extinction for endangerment of the breed, but also that the end of greyhound racing would lead to the commercialized puppy breeding world to then focus on creating profit through these dogs. So the belief here was that it was the racing regulations that actually prevented the pet industry from getting in and exploiting these dogs, that in this way, the racing industry was actually protecting greyhounds. So here Coram's alluding to Probyn-Rapsey's argument about, that extinction and hybridity are in fact distinct. And it's these hybrid greyhounds, it was believed, would develop disease and disorders as a result of commercialized breeding for aesthetics over functionality, as has been observed in other breeds of dogs. So if greyhound as pure and good is pure and good, then to bring in what is not greyhound, so other breeds, into a greyhound's genetic makeup is to make the dogs less good or not good. So participants expressed concerns that if greyhounds are not bred for racing specifically, the breed will be at risk of this pollution and dilution. So, speed up a little bit. The threat of greyhounds as a breed losing their purity through inbreeding and colour selection worried many participants. So this was a greyhound tale of fear. That's the main emotion I sort of coded this whole segment with. Another perceived threat to the purity of the greyhound breed was hunters. So fear of this threat was present across both the communities of racing and rescue. However, interestingly, it was actually more of a dominant concern within the racing communities. So it was particularly a lot of racing participants disliked pig hunting practices, which I thought was interesting. And in particular, the way that the assortment of dogs who were used for hunting these animals, these dogs known as pig dogs, were treated. This seemed to come about particularly when regulations against racing were discussed, with many racing participants pointing out that pig hunting was vastly more violent and dangerous for the dogs involved. And yet they felt that this practice was widely accepted in Australia, which it is. Pig hunting is another typical Australian working class pastime, and it's really exceedingly common within the regional and semi-regional areas where I carried out my field work. So few racing participants were also hunters, while some were, few were, but they did often cross paths in their local community spaces. And because pig dogs have to run down boar and other land-based animals, some racing participants, like Xander here, had over the years been approached by hunters who wanted to breed with greyhounds in order to make these swifter hunters. So I started seeing a language shift here. So while greyhounds in their pure form are respected by racing participants, the language and the narrative around greyhounds changes once the breed is no longer pure in this way. So hybridity has become here entangled with the concept of extinction. The story stops being about the greyhounds and starts to focus on the monsters that come from greyhound breed pollution. So Coram, uses this description for the greyhound hunting dog crossbreeds during our conversation. And, he's voicing how, what could happen if they ban the sport. And these monsters, as they have been called, are not, from my way of thinking, these monsters are not actually being called what they are, which is actually their greyhound puppies, albeit greyhound hybrids. Instead, they're imagined as these deviances of what is good and deviances from what is pure, and they're harming true greyhounds in this way. So just to finish up, I just wanted to quickly talk about how greyhounds as being pure allowed greyhound-oriented to re-establish this sort of bond between stories of greyhounds and the stories they tell to others and to themselves about themselves. So here Chloe, who is anti-racing, discusses how greyhounds, when they're pure, tick all the boxes in terms of what her and her partner were seeking when they wanted to bring a dog into their lives. So they wanted to have a pedigree dog, but they also wanted to have a rescue because they wanted to be saving someone. So in this way, greyhounds are representative of purity whilst also lending their stories of victimhood to that of an overarching narrative of self that's created by the owner. So yeah, basically just to conclude, I just want to put out there that, this kind of promotion of purity and this fear of hybridity, I feel is a really concerning find of the research, and that fear of hybridity interwoven with an ignorance, whether willful or otherwise, of animal sentience. Furthermore, it suggests a view of greyhounds not as individuals, but rather as symbols of a breed, and entrusted with maintaining an ideal, which is a monumental task often not laid out by those whose concerns are applicable to the individual. Thank you. Sorry, I went a bit over time.
It's okay.
Okay, I think, this went slightly over on our presentation, so we'll try and have maybe, slightly shorter question time and then slightly shorter break, and then try and get into our final session a little bit later. That should be fine. But has anyone got any questions? Particularly when I open it up to anyone online as well. If anyone's got any questions, raise your hand. Yeah, got a question. Arturo, do you want to start us off?
I had two questions. One was for Olatz. The question is, well, first of all, thank you for the work. It's really amazing to see how this interrelatedness between human and animal health and how both of them are so interconnected. Quick question. You mentioned that during the interview, some people said that they wanted to move to a more animal-centric form of zookeeping. Did they provide any specific examples of that, or did they have like an institution in mind that said like this place is doing the things right? And then the other one is for Justin. During the two questions for you. During the presentation, you mentioned something about extinction and birth, and mentioned someone that has been working on this. I didn't get the name. If you could repeat that. And the second question is more about the work. It's really fascinating, and this idea of purity and fear or of miscegenation and all of that. I think that at a moment you mentioned that it intersects also with notions of class, like pig hunting and all of this. Did you found any cases in which it also intersected with notions of race, of human race? Okay, and that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the question. That's actually a really interesting one because that's one of the things that surprised us most. That they actually gave some examples of what they would consider a middle ground of transitional status. Some people talked about sanctuary kind of situations. I think there's a couple of them in Spain. One of them is under scrutiny at the moment. Because of not providing adequate care. So it's a bit complicated because some of the alternative models that are being proposed don't have enough funding or resources in a lot of time to provide adequate care. So they are a bit, let's say, they don't talk openly about sanctuaries being better because even if politically they might agree more, looking at it from welfare perspectives, they will consider that a zoo sometimes can provide better care. They gave a couple of examples of a middle ground positions, like I think it's called Mona, sanctuary / refuge in Spain, where primates go to. Many of them are rescued from circuses and zoos and people who had them privately as pets, and they accept visits from schools. So there are children going there from time to time, and they also accept money and conduct research, like PhD research on animal cognition and things like that. So it's not like these individuals are totally free or in a semi-wild environment, or that it is fully animal-centered, but they are in a better situation that they would be in this Barcelona Zoo. And it's like a middle ground they think they could compromise and strive for, something that doesn't stress the non-human animals as much, but they would still have to work for being able to get these resources, something that in sanctuaries, because of not doing that, they don't get to. So that's mostly what they said. Thank you.
So yeah, the scholar that I was talking about, so that's Fiona Probyn Rapsey, and she's at the University of Wollongong here in Australia, and yeah, she talks about dingo protection in Australia, because basically there's not to go into it too much, but there's a whole thing with like, that we need to protect the dingoes, but dingoes breed with wild dogs. So there's this sort of, our government will sort of release, these things where it's like, you can kill all the wild dogs and we just preserve the pure dingoes because they're the only real dingoes. And so, her work's really amazing, and it basically looks at that maybe the dingoes are actually, that's them showing sentience and this, agency to survive in a world where there are not many dingoes left. So yeah, that's her work. In terms of intersections with race, not really. The whole big thing with my thesis ended up being all about intersections with class and gender, that played out in these sort of really different ways to what I thought it was going to. My supervisors especially were, they're both middle class. I'm from a working class background, and they were pretty certain that it was all going to be rescue people were all middle class. But one of the big things why I want to get the data out in the thesis so much is that it's not like that at all, and that's a really common preconception, that anyone that's interested in rescue or advocating for the dogs in that way must be, middle class people with too much time on their hands, when actually, there's this interesting sort of fight for this, the who's got the more dominant narrative of the, this war over, no, we're more working class, no, we're more working class. So yeah, race, not so much.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, it's a question for Olatz. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was really, your reference to the repression on the workers from the workplaces was so disturbing. So I was, in terms of construction and preservation and circulation of narratives and control of them. So I was wondering if you can, obviously, I don't want to force you into saying something that you don't want to share, but or data that you don't have. But has anyone mentioned the forms of repression, of suppression that they had to endure?
Thank you, Bianca. Yes, they did, and several people disclosed things that they couldn't because they had been forced to sign NDAs. We are ranging from being sued to being actually threatened with not getting paid. Some people even threatening with, like, knowing that people have been fired and have been given bad recommendations so that other zoos wouldn't hire them if they had any kind of ethical disagreements. And we're talking about practices that range from content warning, animal death, from some institutions breeding animals for pets and then saying they were using them for conservation, but in hidden areas of zoos. So we're talking about people even consuming some of the animals they are supposed to be taking care of and not being able to denounce it to supervisors or do anything about it because they would know who had talked about it if told to the supervisor. So there are really horrible stories about this, and the repression is real. So that's why it's really difficult for people to collaborate between each other because of fear of being just fired and someone taking your place. And they have more to lose, so they won't complain. And the competition to actually get a good job with more than the minimum wage. So yeah, it is really hard in this industry for the workers. Thank you.
Yes, I think we just might have time for these last two questions. So one in the room and one in the chat. So if you want to.
Yeah, very briefly, all that's because kind of coming on from Arturo's and Bianca's question. All of you three really interesting talks, and I just wondered. So it very much reminds me a bit of talking about media messages and how there's for me immediately a documentary there, right, which could be so impactful. Coming like Blackfish comes to mind, where very similar practices in SeaWorld were discussed, and obviously it goes even into more detail here, which is really interesting. So I was thinking, are you thinking of kind of maybe using this as a, because you kind of said something about media in the beginning, is there some kind of angle there, or maybe even just as Maria said in the beginning of this entire day, how can you turn this into a narrative? You obviously need to find someone who is willing to maybe be on camera, but you can also use, obviously, blurring them out and stuff like that. And the other thing is, just very briefly, Bristol Zoo Project is a really interesting one you might want to look into in regards to being maybe something which comes out of this entire, kind of a bit more of a positive approach. It's a quite interesting one. And the other one might be the Five Sisters Zoo in Scotland, which takes rescue animals in, which made, when you were just saying that rescue animals or like sanctuaries, that's a way forward. That might be an interesting one. I don't know how, you are focused on Spain, obviously, but obviously zoo and that's such an international theme basically in general. But yeah, just on the media one, maybe if you can just quickly answer whether you have any intentions, because obviously this screams for a video, something which gives impact. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the recommendations. I will definitely look into them. And about this, it is something that we are looking into how to angle it so that there are no consequences for the workers, obviously, and they cannot be connected to it, but to also try to push it through a workers' rights perspective, like Maria talked about in the case of prison rights. There's a lot of people that I talked with that don't have that sensibility with zoos, and they were just horrified by the working conditions and the lack of safety and irregularities. So that's something that we are definitely thinking about how to explore, but being someone who is just starting on their research career, still a bit afraid because some of my colleagues have already suffered repercussions from doing things with media. I will take my time to see how to do it so that it's justice for not just the animals, but also the workers, and I don't get sued either. But it's definitely we're considering, because this is something that affects so many lives and so many people don't know about. Thank you.
Yeah, Michael, do you have a question?
My turn?
Yeah.
So yes, let me first start with saying that that was such an amazing panel, and thank you for all the presentation. I'm blown away by all of them. But I have a lot of food for thoughts. But I have a question for Olatz. Sorry, I've been thinking about zoo as an institution of producing and reproducing discourse and discourses, and so I'm thinking, like, are you thinking or interested in frames of the research on, I don't know, like naming or tracking down the discourses they are like workers are using, producing, reproducing? I mean, I don't know how to put it. Like that, for example, like does vets talks like vets, or biologists like biologists, or zookeepers like zookeepers, or maybe zookeepers talk like a little bit like biologists, but also animal like, you know, activists. I don't know if you know what I mean.
Thank you for the question we have. Some of the main thing that arises from this is how disconnected they are. And even if we contacted with a couple of associations of zoo workers in Spain, there are no platforms or like spaces where we can actually get to see or analyze this kind of discourse or research. It's very isolated, and they just have private group chats, sometimes to support each other, but there is no, in contrast with the lobbies that I'm researching, it would be much more difficult. So I guess that if we were to explore that, we could do focus groups or something like that. But because of how fragmented it is and how difficult it is to be able to do it in a safe way for everyone with identity and everything, I guess we could take some patterns out of the interviews, but I don't think we could explore it at the moment, honestly. It's really interesting to look into.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, guys. If everyone's happy just to jump over onto our panel 8, and obviously we're slightly behind on time, so if anyone very quickly needs to go to the toilet or something, you know, have a quick break, we'll try and pretty much jump into.
It's got 1:30, isn't it? Next one. So that's
Yeah, 1:30 to start, yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll just have a quick break now and then we'll get into our final panel, but yeah, join us on over at 9. Yeah.